This morning at 7:41 a.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, March 19, 2026, the Iranian government sent a brief but powerfully worded diplomatic note to exactly 12 important capitals across the globe, including Beijing, Tokyo, Brussels, New Delhi, Seoul, Ankara, Riyadh, Moscow, Islamabad, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, and Pretoria. The message was short, clear, and obviously meant to spread immediately so the whole world would know its contents without any delay from official channels. In that note, Iran declared that it would reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping traffic in exactly 48 hours, but with one very big condition: the reopening would apply only to countries that had not carried out any unilateral military operations or strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Neither the U.S. State Department nor the Pentagon had received even the slightest advance warning about this dramatic development. The White House itself learned about the announcement the same way every ordinary person around the planet did right at that moment, through sudden breaking news reports flashing across screens and alerts. In one single, highly calculated action, Iran has restarted the flow of roughly 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply, while at the same time explicitly ordering America to stay completely on the sidelines and out of the picture. This move does not represent any kind of ceasefire agreement, nor does it amount to a negotiated resolution or any sort of compromise between the parties involved. Instead, what the international community is witnessing unfold in real time is nothing less than one of the most precise, surgical, and effective geopolitical counterstrikes of the entire 21st century so far. Through this announcement, Iran has cleverly reopened the planet's single most critical energy artery, making it available once again to every major economy and trading nation around the world, all while deliberately keeping the full blockade in place against any American commercial interests or vessels. Iran has effectively transformed the Strait of Hormuz into a very public and unmistakable loyalty test for the global community, and nearly every nation on Earth is now stepping forward to meet that test and pass it with flying colors, every single one except the country that originally launched the military strikes in the first place. What we are seeing right now amounts to the complete and total structural collapse of the Trump administration's entire strategy toward Iran. For several long weeks leading up to this shocking moment, officials in Washington had strongly believed and calculated that by keeping the strait tightly closed, they could generate such intense and unbearable global economic pressure that China, Europe, the Gulf states, and other major players would eventually have no realistic choice but to come together and fully unite behind America's ongoing military campaign directed against Tehran. The underlying theory behind this high-stakes approach had seemed elegant and straightforward enough when it was drawn up on paper in strategy sessions. The basic idea was simple: Iran would block the vital flow of oil through the strait, the entire world would direct its anger and blame squarely at Iran for causing the disruption, Iran would then buckle and collapse under the overwhelming weight of maximum economic pain and isolation, and President Trump would ultimately be able to stand tall and claim the greatest foreign policy victory of his entire presidency, perhaps even one for the history books. Yet every single assumption and calculation that had been carefully built into that plan has now shattered completely and irreversibly in the space of just a few hours. Over the course of the next several minutes in this video, I am going to walk you through in clear, detailed, and easy-to-understand terms precisely what Iran announced this morning, explain why this selective reopening of the strait is proving to be far more devastating and humiliating for Washington than the original closure of the waterway had ever managed to be, lay out the quiet but extremely effective diplomatic back channel that has existed between Tehran and Beijing which made this bold announcement possible in the first place, and show exactly why China's direct and deep involvement in the matter means the United States cannot simply reverse or undo this development without immediately triggering an entirely new and potentially even larger international crisis that could spiral out of control. In addition, I will break down the immediate and dramatic market reaction that has already taken place across global exchanges and that clearly confirms how smart money and international capital have already reached their own firm and unflinching judgment about which side has truly come out ahead in this high-stakes confrontation. I will further clarify exactly what this surprising development means for the already postponed Trump-Xi summit and why Beijing now enters any future negotiations holding significant leverage and cards that Washington simply does not possess an effective or quick answer for at this critical time. Finally, toward the end, I will outline 3 realistic and carefully considered scenarios for how the next 72 hours are likely to unfold as the White House scrambles urgently behind the scenes to find some kind of workable response that it does not yet appear to possess. If you have never subscribed to this channel before, I strongly encourage you to do so right now and turn on notifications, because what I am about to show you and explain in depth is simply not being covered or analyzed anywhere else with this same level of precision, honesty, and strategic insight. Let me begin by walking you carefully through the actual Iran announcement itself, because the specific language and phrasing chosen in the diplomatic note was certainly no accident at all. Every single word and every carefully placed phrase appears to have been deliberately selected in order to maximize Washington's public humiliation on the world stage, while at the same time giving the rest of the international community exactly the kind of reassurance, clarity, and legal cover it desperately needed to hear in order to move forward without fear. Iran's communication did not simply describe some temporary or short-term lifting of the existing blockade that everyone had been watching for days. Instead, it very carefully framed the entire action as a permanent restoration of normal commercial passage rights for what the official document referred to as non-aggressor nations. According to the clear and explicit definition provided right there in the text, a non-aggressor nation is defined as any country that has not conducted direct military strikes against Iranian sovereign territory or offered any material military support, logistics, or assistance for such strikes. That straightforward definition completely and permanently excludes the United States. It also completely excludes Israel. At the same time, however, it fully and warmly includes everyone else, every European nation, every major Asian economy, every Gulf state that chose not to participate directly in the strikes, and indeed the entire developing world that has largely stayed on the sidelines. The diplomatic note goes on to specify 5 distinct and very detailed operational components that leave almost nothing to chance or interpretation. First, commercial tankers registered under the flag of any non-aggressor nation are now fully permitted to transit the Strait of Hormuz beginning in 48 hours, and they may do so under completely normal and standard maritime procedures without any special restrictions. Iranian naval vessels will actively escort and protect those passages rather than obstruct or threaten them in any way. Second, major insurance underwriters based in London, Hamburg, Tokyo, and Singapore, who had immediately suspended all coverage for any Hormuz transits the moment the blockade began, are now formally notified that Iranian forces will personally guarantee the physical safety of all qualifying non-aggressor vessels. This strong assurance directly removes the single biggest barrier and fear that had prevented those powerful insurance companies from reinstating full coverage. Third, Iran has committed to providing 72-hour advanced navigational safety certifications to any non-aggressor vessel operator that requests them in advance. This practical step creates a real bureaucratic and administrative infrastructure that effectively turns the selective access into something that functions more like a stable, long-term toll or licensing system rather than a temporary wartime emergency measure that could be reversed overnight. Fourth, the announcement specifically names China, India, Japan, South Korea, and the European Union as priority partners who will receive the fastest and smoothest restoration of the oil flow. This inclusion serves as a deliberate, unmistakable, and very public signal that Iran is not merely reopening the strait out of weakness or desperation but is instead actively and strategically restructuring who stands to benefit the most from its control moving forward in the post-crisis world. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, any attempt by U.S. Navy forces to escort American-flagged vessels or any ships tied closely to American economic interests through the strait will immediately be classified as a hostile military action and will receive an appropriate and decisive military response from Iranian forces. The plain and simple translation of everything in the note is straightforward and unmistakable. The rest of the world is now allowed to watch as the oil begins flowing freely again, but America cannot actually access or participate in that restored flow in any meaningful way. The strategic outcome is therefore no longer just a simple blockade that hurts everyone equally. It has now evolved into a functioning and selective toll booth system operated by Iran, and the United States stands as the only major nation on Earth that lacks the necessary token or permission required to enter and pass through safely. This brings us to the deeper diplomatic architecture that quietly sits behind this bold announcement and explains precisely why the Trump administration never saw this move coming and currently has no ready or effective response prepared to deploy on short notice. According to multiple reliable diplomatic sources who possess direct knowledge of the Tehran-Beijing back channel, China's special envoy was quietly dispatched to the region within just a few hours of the initial U.S.-Israeli strikes that tragically resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei. That high-level Chinese envoy then spent a full 9 days engaged in intensive, closed-door discussions that went well beyond any basic humanitarian ceasefire language that Washington had been publicly demanding in its statements. Instead, those conversations covered a complete and ambitious framework for the entire post-conflict regional order in the Middle East. Beijing's core offer to Tehran was both comprehensive and deeply strategic in nature. China pledged to ensure that Iran's oil export revenues would be fully restored and protected within just 90 days of any reopening of the strait. China also committed to purchasing large volumes of Iranian crude oil at contracted prices deliberately set well above current volatile market levels for the next 3 full years, providing Tehran with a stable and predictable financial lifeline. In addition, Beijing promised to dramatically accelerate major infrastructure investments under the existing long-term China-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement, which already locks in an impressive $400 billion in Chinese investment spread across the next 25 years. In exchange for these substantial, game-changing commitments from the world's second-largest economy, Iran agreed to proceed with this highly selective reopening that explicitly and permanently excludes the United States and its closest partners in the military campaign. This secret arrangement has delivered 2 extraordinary strategic gifts directly into Beijing's hands at a critical moment. First, China has now secured guaranteed access to low-cost and reliable energy supplies precisely when global oil markets remain most disrupted, unpredictable, and expensive for everyone else. Second, China has powerfully demonstrated to every nation watching around the world that it possesses both the diplomatic skill and the economic muscle to resolve a major crisis that was originally created and escalated by the United States. In doing so, Beijing has successfully positioned itself as the indispensable diplomatic actor and mediator operating in the most strategically sensitive and valuable waterway on the entire planet. Let's look closely at the hard energy arithmetic that makes this move so painful for Washington. Before the blockade ever began, approximately 21 million barrels of oil transited the Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis, representing roughly 21% of total global oil consumption. During the period of the full closure, global oil prices surged well past $140 per barrel for the first time since the 2008 financial crisis. China, which imports around 11 million barrels per day and sources nearly half of that volume through the Hormuz corridor, was facing additional daily energy costs estimated at $350 million every single day when compared with pre-crisis price levels. The selective reopening has now eliminated that entire massive daily cost burden for Beijing in one clean stroke, giving Chinese industries and consumers an immediate and enormous competitive advantage. For Washington and American businesses, however, the calculation runs strongly in the opposite and much more painful direction. American energy companies with direct interests in Gulf production, American airlines operating with hedged fuel contracts, and American manufacturers heavily dependent on petrochemical inputs must all continue operating under these painfully high $140 per barrel conditions for the foreseeable future. Meanwhile, their Chinese, European, Japanese, and South Korean competitors are able to return immediately to much lower-cost supply chains and pricing. The competitive disadvantage this situation creates for the broader American industrial base only continues to compound and widen with every passing week and month. The selective blockade against American interests therefore remains firmly and effectively in place even as the rest of the world moves on. Another critical and often underreported element involves the insurance architecture that has played such a decisive role throughout the entire Hormuz crisis. When the blockade first took hold, Lloyd's of London and the wider international maritime insurance market immediately suspended all war risk coverage for any vessels foolish enough to attempt transits. Without that essential war risk coverage firmly in place, commercial shipping companies found themselves legally and financially unable to operate vessels through the strait, regardless of any physical safety assurances that navies might offer on the water. Iran's announcement directly addressed and solved this specific problem for all non-aggressor nations by supplying formal navigational safety certifications that were precisely what Lloyd's had privately indicated would be sufficient to allow coverage to be reinstated quickly for non-US vessels. Within just 90 minutes of the Iranian note becoming public, industry sources in London confirmed that emergency review processes had already been launched to reinstate full coverage for Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and European flag tankers. While the physical strait itself will reopen in 48 hours, the all-important insurance market has effectively reopened this very morning for everyone except America. The markets delivered their own swift and unambiguous verdict on the situation within only 22 minutes of the Iranian announcement first hitting the wire services. Several major market movements occurred simultaneously across global exchanges. Brent crude experienced a sharp and dramatic drop of between $18 and $40 per barrel in a single trading session, marking one of the largest single-day declines in oil prices since the 2020 COVID-related demand collapse. Chinese equities listed on Hong Kong markets surged by more than 3% on the clear expectation of immediate and substantial relief from elevated energy costs. European energy company stocks, including those of Total, Shell, and BP, advanced between 4 and 7% as their Gulf supply chains began reopening for business. In stark contrast, American energy companies with production chains closely tied to the Hormuz route saw their shares decline noticeably. At the same time, the US dollar weakened noticeably against the euro, the yuan, the yen, and the Korean won. This currency movement served as a strong and unmistakable signal that global capital is already pricing in a strategic defeat for the nation that still controls the world's primary reserve currency. Markets are not pausing to wait for political spin, official statements, or lengthy analysis from pundits. Markets have already reached their own clear, cold, and data-driven conclusion about who ultimately won this round of the confrontation. The diplomatic isolation signal has now become impossible for Washington to ignore or downplay. When the United States initially launched its military campaign against Iran, the strategic theory assumed that America's traditional allies would quickly and loyally align themselves behind the American position, creating a united Western front that would leave Tehran facing overwhelming pressure. Yet what the Iranian announcement has starkly revealed is almost the exact opposite situation playing out in public view. Not a single one of the 12 nations that received Iran's diplomatic note has issued any statement condemning the selective reopening. France's foreign ministry instead welcomed the restoration of freedom of navigation in the region as a positive step. Germany's powerful trade associations described the move as a significant and much-needed relief for European supply chains struggling under high costs. Japan's government stated that it was reviewing the announcement with cautious but genuine optimism. South Korea's energy ministry promptly convened an emergency review meeting focused squarely on reinstatement timelines for its imports. China's foreign ministry noted that Beijing has consistently advocated for diplomatic resolutions and that the announcement itself reflects the importance of continued dialogue over conflict. Not one allied government has gone on record characterizing the selective exclusion of the United States as unfair, provocative, or destabilizing in any way. That widespread and coordinated silence has now conveyed everything Washington needed to understand about its current isolated position on the world stage. Here is what actually took place inside the White House once the announcement first broke. The National Security Council duty officer woke the National Security Advisor within minutes of the news surfacing on global media. The very first urgent question raised was whether the Iranian announcement could be independently confirmed as authentic rather than some kind of sophisticated disinformation. It was quickly verified as genuine through 3 separate and reliable intelligence channels. The Situation Room was immediately activated at full capacity, and all senior NSC staff members were recalled to their posts without any delay. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who had only just returned from important debriefing sessions after the recent Paris trade talks with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng that had concluded only days earlier, was patched directly into the high-level Situation Room call. According to sources familiar with the intense discussion, Secretary Bessent immediately recognized and highlighted the clear connection between the Iranian announcement and the recent Beijing trade negotiations. He pointed out that China's willingness to engage seriously on tariff issues during the Paris meetings was almost certainly coordinated with Beijing's prior awareness that this selective reopening announcement was imminent and carefully timed. In other words, China had sat across the negotiating table from American officials, engaged in what appeared to be good faith discussions focused on trade optics and mutual benefits, and simultaneously withheld the critical information that Iran was about to execute a move granting Beijing lasting structural leverage over American foreign policy for many months to come. When President Trump himself was finally briefed on the rapidly evolving situation, multiple sources described the conversation as notably tense, direct, and filled with frustration. Trump's initial sharp question focused on whether the U.S. Navy could physically prevent or block Chinese and European tankers from transiting the strait if American vessels remained fully excluded. Military advisors explained in detail that any such intervention would immediately constitute an act of war directed not just against Iran but against allied and partner nations as well, and would trigger broad and coordinated economic retaliation from both Europe and Asia at the same time. Trump then asked whether the United States could impose new sanctions on any company or nation choosing to use the reopened strait under Iran's terms. Legal advisors responded that attempting to sanction European, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean energy companies for engaging in lawful commerce within international waters would provoke immediate and powerful retaliatory sanctions from the European Union, China, Japan, and South Korea. Those four major entities together represent a staggering 58% of the entire global economy, making such a move potentially suicidal for American interests. The White House eventually released a carefully worded and deliberately vague public statement indicating that the administration was closely monitoring the situation and would respond using all available tools to protect American interests. Notably, that statement did not specify or even hint at what those tools might actually be in practice. Secretary of State Marco Rubio attempted to reach his counterparts in France, Germany, Japan, and South Korea by phone on an urgent basis. All four calls either went straight to voicemail or were handled only by much lower-level deputies rather than the ministers themselves. The fact that four key allied foreign ministers failed to take or return those calls on the same morning is not coincidental or accidental in any way. It represents a deliberate, unmistakable, and very public diplomatic message about shifting global alignments. Let me now outline three distinct and realistic scenarios for how the next 72 hours may develop as events continue to unfold rapidly. Scenario 1 involves a form of forced or quiet acceptance by the administration. In this path, the White House comes to the difficult realization that it possesses no viable military, economic, or diplomatic tool capable of reversing the selective reopening without triggering a broader and punishing coalition of retaliation from multiple powerful partners at once. As a result, the administration quietly adjusts to the uncomfortable new reality while publicly attempting to frame the reopening as some kind of strategic win or success for American policy pressure. Officials would argue that sustained U.S. military pressure had successfully forced Iran to reopen the strait for the benefit of the entire world, which had always been the publicly stated goal from the beginning. The messaging, however, would carefully avoid addressing the awkward reality that American vessels remained fully excluded, that China played the decisive behind-the-scenes role in engineering the outcome, and that the already delayed Trump-Xi summit will now proceed with Beijing holding significant cards and leverage that Washington lacks any clear or immediate answer for. Scenario 2 represents the dangerous escalation trap that many fear most. Here, President Trump, unwilling to accept what would appear as a visible and humiliating strategic defeat on the global stage, issues direct orders for the U.S. Navy to escort American interest vessels through the strait regardless of Iran's explicit exclusion order and warnings. Iran responds by taking firm and direct military action against the escort convoy to enforce its terms. The conflict, which had been gradually showing signs of moving toward some form of de-escalation, suddenly reignites and intensifies dramatically. Oil prices surge back above the $140 per barrel level almost instantly. Europe and Asia, whose supply chains had only just begun to recover and stabilize, now face renewed and costly disruptions and publicly place the full blame on Washington for triggering a fresh and unnecessary crisis. China and Russia quickly call for emergency sessions of the United Nations Security Council to condemn the actions. NATO unity begins to fracture seriously as European nations refuse to endorse or support any military action that directly harms their own critical energy supplies and economic recovery. In this scenario, Trump may achieve a short-term tactical military engagement or show of force, but the long-term cost would be catastrophic strategic isolation for the United States on the global stage. Scenario 3 centers on what some insiders are already calling the Beijing pivot. In this case, the White House fully acknowledges that China both quietly brokered the current selective reopening outcome and now effectively controls the next critical moves in the chess game. As a result, officials dramatically fast-track the long-postponed Trump-Xi summit, shifting its entire purpose from a routine state visit to an urgent emergency negotiation session. Trump places a direct and personal call to President Xi and requests a comprehensive deal to resolve the impasse. China then leverages its established and proven influence with Tehran to extend the strait reopening to finally include American vessels as well. In return, Beijing seeks and likely extracts meaningful concessions on Section 301 investigations, certain tariff rollbacks that favor Chinese exports, and important adjustments to U.S. technology export controls that have long restricted Chinese access to advanced semiconductors and other key technologies. She agrees to move forward with a structured framework for these conversations. The summit itself takes place within 2 weeks at most. Beijing ultimately extracts significant trade concessions, technology policy rollbacks, and even public acknowledgement of its important mediating role in the crisis, all in exchange for an Iranian action that was taken only on China's recommendation and timing. In the end, the United States may get its ships through the strait once again, but only as a negotiated favor delivered by China at a very steep strategic and economic price that could reshape global power dynamics for years. I will be closely watching 3 specific and telling developments over the next 72 hours as the situation evolves. The first is whether Lloyd's of London formally and officially reinstates full war risk coverage for Chinese and European tankers by Friday morning at the latest. That single concrete step would mark the irreversible moment when the selective reopening becomes both legally and commercially permanent, rendering it practically impossible for anyone to reverse without massive financial and legal fallout. The second key development to monitor concerns whether the Trump administration reaches out to Beijing through quiet back channels to request Chinese mediation or assistance regarding access for American vessels. Any such contact would signal very clearly that Washington has privately accepted the shifted global power structure and is now seeking direct help from Beijing to fix a problem of its own making. The third development worth watching closely is whether any prominent Republican senator or influential voice within the party publicly calls for a full and independent congressional review of the entire Iran military strategy. When that call eventually comes, as many expect it will soon, it will represent the first open and honest admission from within the president's own political coalition that this campaign simply did not proceed as originally planned or promised. In conclusion, Iran reopened the Strait of Hormuz this morning in a highly selective manner. It reopened the passage comfortably for China, for Europe, for Japan, for South Korea, for India, and for every other nation on Earth that never fired a single missile or offered direct military support against it. It left America standing outside the gate, watching as the oil flows again for everyone else. The original strategy had been to apply relentless maximum military pressure in order to bring Iran to its knees and force compliance. Instead, Iran took that very same American military pressure and skillfully used it as a tool to fracture the long-standing alliance structure that has underpinned real American power and influence around the world for decades. That outcome is not merely a partial failure, a minor tactical setback, or something that can be easily spun away in press briefings. It represents a strategic reversal of truly historic proportions that will be studied by diplomats, military strategists, and historians for many years to come. And the entire world has now seen it happen live, in real time, with crystal clarity. The balance of power in the global energy game has shifted, perhaps permanently, and the coming days will reveal whether Washington can adapt quickly enough or whether the costs of this miscalculation will continue to mount. Stay tuned as this story develops rapidly. The next 72 hours could reshape the international order in ways few predicted even a week ago.